They say you'll remember the clink of the glass before the words, but I don't. Not the sound, not the weight of the crystal stem in my father's hand. What I remember is the silence that followed, the stretch of air between syllables, the chuckle from Elise, the quick dart of eyes toward me, the way even the server with the wine bottle froze mid-pour. We were at the Fairlake Country Club, the kind of place with white linen napkins folded into fans and chandeliers that drip like sugar glass. My father, Robert Wexler, had just given 37 years to Wexler & Sons Engineering. That night was his send-off, his coronation, his big goodbye. I was seated at table 2. Not the head table, not even the one closest to it. Table 2, just far enough to be out of frame in the photos, but close enough to hear the insult land with precision. Dad rose, smiling his signature CEO smile. The one that had closed hundreds of deals, settled dozens of disputes, and somehow always left him looking like the most reasonable man in the room. He tapped his glass once sharply. Not for attention, but for authority. The room quieted. He began with the usual script gratitude for the team, the legacy, the sacrifices made. Elise was praised for holding the family together. Rowan was the next generation of Wexler vision. Then, with a dramatic pause that felt almost rehearsed, he turned slightly in my direction. And to all my children, he said, raising his glass high to the ones who stood by me, believed in me, and never turned their back on family. He looked away. Then, deliberately, "Not you, Julia." The laughter started as a ripple. Elise laughed first, bright and airy like it was a charming little inside joke. A few of Dad's old business partners followed suit, unsure but obedient. Someone clapped. The clatter of silverware covered the gasp I know I didn't make. Because I didn't gasp, I didn't flinch, I didn't blink, I stood. The fabric of my navy dress settled around my legs. I reached for my glass, not wine water. I never drink at family events. I need to stay clear, need to see every move before it's made. I raised my glass steady as glassware under fluorescent light, and I said simply quietly so even those at the back of the ballroom could hear, to the daughter who funded this entire evening, including your golf membership. There wasn't a crash, no audible gasp, just stillness, the kind that makes your ears ring, the kind that feels like the moment before a lightning strike. Let me back up. My name is Julia Wexler. I'm 33 years old, a financial advisor by trade, and a nonprofit founder by passion. I started a financial literacy program for young women at 28 after years of watching too many girls drown in debt. They didn't understand and support systems that failed them. I live alone in a restored brownstone outside Chicago and eat dinner at the same window seat every night. I'm the kind of woman people call intense-driven or, on less generous days, cold. But I've never been careless, especially not with family. For years, I tried to play my part quietly, competently, and more often than I care to admit, invisibly. When Elise needed help with fertility treatments her insurance wouldn't cover, I wired the funds without a second thought. When Rowan needed a lawyer after a startup collapse and an ugly NDA breach, I connected him with a former client and paid the retainer. When Mom needed post-op physical therapy after her fall but refused to dip into Dad's retirement pot, I covered it discreetly. And when Dad mentioned casually over coffee that the IRS was looking into a 5-year-old error on the business tax filings, something he'd ignored, I offered to help. Not out of guilt, not out of duty, out of love, out of a belief that family, real family, isn't about proximity or praise. It's about showing up even when no one notices. Especially when no one notices, they never noticed. When the invitations for the retirement party were printed, my name wasn't listed among the hosts. I'd paid for the venue deposit, selected the caterer, even ordered the signature cocktail napkins printed with cheers to Robert the Builder. But when the seating chart went up, I was placed with distant cousins and 2 former interns who barely remembered my name. I didn't say anything. I never do. Not when Elise forgets to return my calls for weeks, only to text, "Can you look over our finances?" Not when Rowan brags about bootstrapping his ventures with no mention of the 6-figure personal loan I forgave. Not when Dad introduces me to colleagues, as our independent one said, like a compliment meant like a caution. But that night, in the warm hum of crystal and linen and applause, something broke. Or maybe something finally snapped back into place. Because when Dad raised his glass and erased me in front of 100 people, most of whom I'd helped in some way over the years, I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't miscommunication or generational differences or just his way. It was a message. Clear and calculated. I was not part of the legacy. I was the ledger behind it, so I stood toasted and spoke the truth they'd long pretended not to see. The truth I had enabled by staying quiet, the truth that was about to change everything. This isn't the story of a party that went wrong, it's the story of everything that came after. And I promise, it only gets quieter before it gets loud. I don't remember the first time I realized I wasn't the kind of daughter my parents celebrated. It wasn't one moment, it was dozens of quiet ones stacked like bricks, sideways glances, forgotten thank yous, compliments that sounded more like corrections. I was the easy one, the no-trouble child. And in our house, that meant invisible. Elise was the light. Soft-spoken musical, always in a pastel dress with her hair curled into ribbons. She cried easily and often, which meant people rushed to soothe her. Rowan was the firework, rambunctious, athletic, loud. My father adored him, called him champ even when he failed his first semester of college. He's a builder like me, Dad would say. Big picture guy. And me, I was the graph paper between their bursts of color. Straight lines, right angles, order. I didn't slam doors. I organized my sock drawer by color at age 7. I once rewrote our dishwasher chore chart so it optimized for who had soccer practice which night. I wasn't unloved, but I wasn't understood either. You're so mature, Mom would say with a tired smile, which I learned meant, you'll take care of it so I don't have to. On my 16th birthday, I opened a small box from Dad with a folded paper inside. It wasn't a necklace or a keepsake. It was a list of recommended index funds and a handwritten note. Let's talk real wealth sometime. I thanked him genuinely. I thought he was inviting me into something, but months later, when I asked to shadow him at work, he blinked and said, "Why would you want to do that? You're not a numbers guy. You're a calculator. There's a difference." That was the same summer Elise was flown to New York for a youth choir showcase, and Rowan got a used BMW for graduation, neither of which they paid a cent toward. I bought my first car with part-time wages from tutoring math and managing the cash register at a bookstore. When I told Dad I'd negotiated the price down $1 or $200 below market, he laughed and said, "I swear you're more banker than daughter." I wanted that to be a joke, but it never sounded like one. College was the only time I truly felt like I belonged anywhere. Northwestern gave me a merit scholarship, and I worked every semester to cover the rest. I graduated early, accepted a job at a boutique wealth firm, and by 25, I was managing accounts for people twice my age. Clients trusted me. They said I had integrity. I was known for discretion, for fixing problems before they became disasters. At home, though, none of that mattered. When Elise dropped out of her education program to get married at 23, she was so grounded. When Rowan failed upward through 2 business ventures, both funded quietly by Dad, he was taking risks. When I launched a nonprofit teaching personal finance to first-gen college women, Dad told me, "It's a noble side hobby, but you'll want something real eventually." I didn't argue. I stopped arguing after a while. It felt like trying to shout through glass. Instead, I started keeping track. Not to throw anything in anyone's face, but to remember. To remember that I had, in fact, shown up. That I wasn't cold or distant, I was generous in ways they didn't have the language to see. The spreadsheet started on a whim. I'd just wired Elise $4 or $300 to cover her second failed IVF attempt. Her husband, Kyle, was between jobs again. They'd been too embarrassed to ask Dad. I added a note in the corner of the file, Elise. May 17th, IVF attempt number 2. It became a habit. Each entry grounded me. It turned the chaos into a kind of math. Numbers didn't lie. Within 2 years, there were over 50 line items. Car repairs, emergency flights, legal fees, a few things I'd rather not explain. I always told myself it was temporary, that once they stabilized, once they found their footing, it would all balance out. But balance was never the goal. I was just easier to lean on. The day Rowan asked me to co-sign on a lease for his new startup's warehouse space, I said yes before he finished the sentence. When I sent over the paperwork and noticed the name on the LLC was misspelled, I corrected it. He didn't even notice. That was fine. I didn't need the credit, but the moment that made something inside me twist wasn't dramatic. It came years later over a Sunday brunch. Elise was talking about how emotional labor was exhausting, how she carried so much of the family's emotional weight. She looked directly at me and said, "You're lucky, Jules. You're not really the emotional type. You just send money." Everyone laughed. I smiled, topped off my mimosa, and wrote the sentence down in my notes app under the tab labeled Things They Say. Later that night, I added 2 new rows to the spreadsheet. Line 73, Dad's dentist bill, uninsured portion, $880. Line 74, Elise, therapy, copay coverage, 6 sessions, $360. That was 4 years before the retirement party. 4 years before, I realized that what I thought was keeping peace was really just postponing a reckoning. And even then, I wasn't angry. Not yet. The spreadsheet has 123 line items now. The formatting is color-coded, categorized clean, just like everything else I manage. Sometimes I open it without thinking, like muscle memory, like checking the weather. I'll scroll through the rows. Elise, Rowan, Mom, Dad, each name anchored to a date, a dollar amount, a note in the margin. I don't do it out of spite. I do it to remind myself I was there, even when they pretended I wasn't. Line 3, Elise, IVF consultation, $275. Line 9, Rowan, DUI attorney retainer, $3,500. Line 22, Dad, IRS back tax penalty relief, $620. Line 31, Mom, private home nurse, post-knee surgery, $2,400. That one. Line 31. That one still sits wrong in my chest. It was 2 winters ago. Mom had taken a fall on the stairs and didn't want to fuss. She told Dad not to worry, told me she'd bounce back like always. The hospital discharged her after 2 nights, and she insisted she didn't need in-home help. But I knew better. I contacted a nurse. I trusted someone I'd met through a client's long-term care plan and paid out of pocket to ensure she came twice a day for 3 weeks. No one said thank you. In fact, Dad made a joke a month later about how Mom's bounce back was all her own grit, not some nurse with a clipboard. I used to imagine it would feel different seeing the numbers laid out like this, like some part of me might feel proud or vindicated. But the truth is, it just feels cold, like a ledger with no bottom line. Rowan once told me, half drunk at a wedding, that he appreciated how quietly I always came through. He thought it was a compliment. I almost laughed. He doesn't remember the time I booked him a last-minute flight home from Austin because his license was suspended and he didn't want to miss Dad's company anniversary gala. I covered the car service to and from the airport. He showed up 2 hours late, reeking of whiskey, and still got a toast from Dad about resilience. And Elise, God, Elise. She once said during one of her fertility spirals, "I just don't know how you always have it, so together, Jules. You must not want things the way I do." She was crying on the kitchen floor. I'd just transferred $4,800 to her account to cover the next round of treatment. Her husband, Kyle, was in the living room arguing with their insurance provider. I wanted to scream. Instead, I made tea. That was the pattern. They fell apart. I held steady. They demanded. I delivered. They forgot I remembered. Line 56, Rowan, co-signed lease default $9,000. Line 78, Dad, CPA audit consultation $1, $200. Line 84, Elise, mortgage escrow shortfall $2,900. Line 97, family event, Mother's Day retreat cabin deposit, never reimbursed $1, $500. That one hurts more than it should. The cabin was Elise's idea, a healing weekend for Mom, something rustic and restorative with matching robes and charcuterie boards. I paid the deposit before she even confirmed who was attending. The weekend came and went. I never got an invitation. What I've come to understand, what took me far too long to name, is that they don't forget out of malice. They forget because forgetting is convenient. Gratitude requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would mean confronting just how much they've leaned on someone they claim not to understand. There was a time I thought they might surprise me, that maybe after a big gesture, a medical bill paid a car crisis, solved a business loan, refinanced, someone would take me aside and say, "We see you," but they never did. Not once. Gratitude in my family is reserved for emotion, for visible acts of closeness. Tears, hugs, grand proclamations over casseroles. They worship effort they can feel, not effort that holds them up in silence. It's strange how deep the silence goes. At Dad's retirement party, when he excluded me from that toast, the worst part wasn't the joke, it was the people who laughed. The ones I'd helped, sometimes directly, often quietly, who couldn't even look surprised. As if they believed it too. As if they had always seen me as adjacent, useful, but not real. The daughter who sends money, not the daughter who belongs. I used to think maybe it was my fault that I didn't let them in, didn't make enough space for connection. That if I'd been warmer, softer, more expressive, they might have responded in kind. But that's not how families like mine work. Emotion isn't currency. Usefulness is. And I've been deeply, relentlessly useful. Line 101, Elise. Emergency vet bill, her dog, not mine. $380. Line 112, Rowan. Bounced check fees covered to avoid embarrassment. $420. Line 119, Dad. Club membership renewal auto-debited from my account. $1, $100. Line 123, retirement party. Full balance due $8,000. That last one. That's where the file ends for now. Paid in full 2 days before the event. I paid it not out of habit or obligation, but because I hadn't yet realized it would be the last thing I'd ever give them without question. I'm still deciding what happens next. Not in the dramatic sense. I'm not plotting revenge or staging some kind of moral reckoning, but I am considering something radical in my world, accountability. Because it's not that they didn't notice what I gave, it's that they didn't want to. And now I think they're going to have to. The first message came at 7:12 the next morning. I hadn't even made coffee yet. My phone buzzed, screen lighting up with my father's name, the kind of notification that used to make me stand straighter like I was reporting to a performance review. I let it go to voicemail. His voice was sharp-clipped like the edges of a memo he wished he could retract. "You humiliated me, Julia. In front of clients, in front of my friends. That's not how we handle things in this family." No mention of what he said. Just my reaction, my nerve, my disobedience. I didn't reply. At 9:03, Elise chimed in. A text. Just one line. So transactional of you, as if the irony of that sentence didn't curl around itself like smoke. She'd once cried to me over not being able to afford a second round of IVF, and I covered the cost before she even asked. She'd forgotten, of course. That's the thing about family like mine. They remember emotion and forget who paid for the roof holding it up. Rowan, ever the diplomat, sent his message closer to noon. Wow. You really think money buys respect? He'd texted it like a punchline. No context, no punctuation, just that floating phrase like a feather dipped in oil. I imagined him pacing around his apartment, maybe still half drunk from the after party. Maybe not. Either way, he still owed me over $9,000 I never asked back. I placed the phone face down on the table and watched the steam curl from my coffee. There was no rage, no adrenaline, just a strange, cooling kind of stillness. Like my body had finally registered that I didn't owe them an answer. By noon, I'd opened the spreadsheet. It took a minute to recenter the document. I added the final line, retirement party, Fair Lake Country Club, $8,000. Then with a few keystrokes, I changed the file name. In case you forgot, .xlsx, I uploaded it to a new email. No greeting, no sign-off. Just a blank body and the subject line. For reference, the email went to 4 people, Dad, Mom, Elise, and Rowan. Their names typed deliberately with no emotion. I didn't attach any explanation. I didn't need to. The numbers spoke for themselves. 8 years of silent support, categorized by date recipient and reason. I'd added a tab labeled recurring assistance and another for emergency coverage. I highlighted a few lines for clarity. The rest I left plain. 20 minutes later, I saw the read receipts. Then nothing. I wasn't surprised. I walked to the window of my apartment mug, still warm in my hands. Outside the street was quiet, the sidewalk blanketed in a layer of leaves that hadn't been swept yet. I remembered when I first moved here how I bought this place on my own after saving for 6 years. No one asked to tour it, no one helped me carry boxes. But when Elise came to visit a year later, she smiled and said, "It's very sterile. Do you ever decorate with anything emotional?" I had smiled then too, and still I offered her the guest room when she said she needed space from Kyle. My phone buzzed again around 3 p.m. A second email arrived from Dad. The subject line read, "Not the forum." I didn't open it. I didn't need to know what excuse or correction was waiting inside. I'd lived it. By sunset, I had received nothing from Mom. She was always the slowest to react. Passive, polite, more invested in keeping the peace than questioning the war. I imagined her sitting at the kitchen table, biting her lip, wondering what she could say that wouldn't sound like betrayal. I didn't want an apology. I wanted clarity. And maybe, if I was honest, I wanted them to feel for just one moment the weight of being the one who holds everything together while everyone else acts like it's natural. Later that night, I checked the spreadsheet one more time. I didn't revise it. I didn't defend it. I just sat with it like sitting with an old photograph you're finally ready to believe. It wasn't anger that settled in me. It was freedom. A quiet one, like a room with the windows finally cracked open after years of stale air. There was still more to come, I knew that. This wouldn't be the last message or the last dig, but I also knew something had shifted. Not in them, in me. For the first time, I wasn't bracing to explain myself. I was done explaining. It arrived on a Tuesday. A manila envelope slightly creased at the corners wedged between a marketing flyer and a dentist appointment reminder in my mailbox. No, return address. Just my name, printed in neat block letters, Julia Wexler, as if typed on a label maker or printed with intention. I turned it over in my hands as I stood in the hallway key, still between my fingers. There was nothing handwritten, no stamp. Someone had dropped it off directly. That fact alone narrowed the possibilities, and not in a comforting way. I waited until I was inside, jacket off, coffee reheated. I didn't rush to open it. Something about the weight of the envelope made me pause. It wasn't thick, but it felt deliberate, like someone had taken their time choosing exactly what to include. The documents inside were clipped together at the top left corner, 3 packets carefully arranged. The first page bore the Wexler family trust header. My father's name, my mother's. A trust account that had been dormant, so I'd been told, since I was in college. I'd heard about it once during a conversation I wasn't supposed to overhear. "That's our rainy day fund," Dad had said, "for the big things." The statement summary covered the past 14 months. Page after page, transaction after transaction. Withdrawals labeled E. Wexler or E. Carson Elise's married name. Some as low as $180, others over $5,000. A handful marked as emergency reimbursement. One noted simply boutique vendor. I flipped to the last page. Total outflow 48, 2/10/27. No deposits, no documentation. Just a steady leak from a faucet no one had admitted still ran. The second packet was worse. It was a will unsigned but clearly recent, dated just 6 months prior. The header read, "Draft, Wexler Family Estate." It began with the usual language being of sound mind, directing all assets to surviving spouse, then children. 3 names were listed: Rowan Wexler, Elise Wexler-Worthing, and a conspicuous blank space beneath them. A space where my name had once been. Further down in the paragraph outlining responsibilities of execution, there was a line struck through with blue ink appointing eldest daughter Julia Wexler as primary executor, replaced by appointing Rowan Wexler. The page felt heavier than it should have. Not for what it meant legally. I hadn't expected to inherit anything not truly, but because of what it said out loud. They weren't just using me. They were rewriting me out. I stared at the last page longer than I needed to. The signature lines were blank. No initials, no dates. But it was detailed, specific, prepared. Not a fantasy draft, a plan. The third packet was the shortest, a single sheet of lined paper folded 3 times with a Post-it note stuck to the top. The handwriting was shaky, slightly slanted, written in black ink that had smudged faintly at the edges. "She's taking everything and he's letting her. You deserve to know." 2. No name, no context. Just that one sentence like a whisper slipped beneath a locked door. I set the papers down, slowly pressing my palm against the table to still the heat rising beneath my skin. I wasn't sure which part unsettled me more, the transactions Elise never admitted, or the quiet decision to remove me from a role I'd been told was mine since I was 23. One day, when I'm gone, you'll handle things, Dad once said. You're the only one with the head for it. He'd said it after a second scotch in the middle of a tax season meltdown. I'd believed him. Now I realized belief was always optional for them, conditional, convenient. Mine was simply expected. I looked again at the withdrawals, boutique vendors, online transfers, a few labeled spa weekend, one noted as emergency HVSC, all signed E. Carson. Elise. I could picture her now apologizing vaguely to Dad while swiping his account card, calling it temporary or just to float us through this rough patch. I didn't doubt she'd smoothed it over with a smile and a hug. Elise's genius wasn't in deception. It was in making the lie sound like a kindness. And Dad, he must have known, or chosen not to, which in my family was the same thing. The envelope hadn't come from him. That much I knew. He wouldn't be that indirect. Nor Elise. She wasn't self-aware enough to believe I deserved to know anything. That left one option. Mom. Marla Wexler, the woman who once told me some things are better left unsaid when I confronted her about Rowan's second defaulted loan. The woman who never intervened when Elise cut me off mid-sentence or when Dad called me calculating like it was a slur. But she'd also been the one who offered me quiet glances across dinner tables, who once left a check on my desk marked, "For your generosity. Don't tell your father." It wasn't hard to imagine her finding a copy of the will printing statements from the home office computer and stuffing them into a plain envelope on a day she finally couldn't keep swallowing. Still, she hadn't signed the note. I stared at it one last time, then carefully placed all the documents back into the envelope and tucked it into my desk drawer. Not because I didn't believe them. I believed every line, every number, but because I knew instinctively this was leverage. Not against them, not for revenge, but for something far more dangerous to people, like my family. Boundaries. And this time, I had them in writing. The driveway still crunched the same. That faint gravel crackle under my boots, like someone shifting bones beneath the surface. The hedges were overgrown now, curling wild along the walkway, and the paint on the porch rail had started to peel in long, vertical strips, quiet signs of a house cared for, just enough to pretend nothing was falling apart. The Wexler house wasn't grand by any means. It was a classic two-story colonial with black shutters, stone chimney, and a wraparound porch my father swore he'd build himself, though we all knew he'd hired a contractor and spent a single Saturday supervising. But to me it had always been the one constant. I knew every creaking board in the hallway, every door that needed a hip bump to close. I used to believe it would be mine someday, not in a greedy, expectant way, but in the quiet confidence of a child who'd been promised something that felt like security. I could still hear him saying it. One summer afternoon, I was maybe 12, standing by the garden bed with dirt under my nails. This house, Dad said, patting the roof of the riding mower like it was a thoroughbred, will go to the one who can keep it standing. That'll be you, Jules. You've got the head for it. At the time, it felt like an honor. Now I understand it was a contingency plan. I stepped onto the porch and looked through the front window. The living room hadn't changed. Same beige sofa, same dull rug with the worn patch near the coffee table. There was a new patio set in the back, one of those expensive teak ones you see in design catalogs. It looked out of place, like someone tried to rebrand the past with throw pillows. According to the records in the envelope, the house was remortgaged twice in the last 3 years. First, to help Elise and Kyle build a custom pergola and outdoor kitchen. They posted about it on Instagram under the caption, "Turning our backyard into a sanctuary." Then again, less than a year later, for Rowan's vineyard startup. He called it Legacy Hill, which felt ironic now. The business folded in 8 months. The house, however, stayed in his name on the paperwork. No one told me any of it. Not when the equity line was opened. Not when the second mortgage was signed, not when the repayment stopped and the penalties started. It was always my name when something needed fixing. Never when something was taken. That afternoon, I met Alma Klein in her office, an unassuming building downtown with exposed brick filtered light and a row of real plants along the windowsill. She wore a blazer the color of slate and glasses she pushed up every time she said something surgical. I looked over the documents you sent, she said, flipping through a folder so clean it made my stomach tighten. What you're describing isn't unusual, it's just not often named. I sat across from her, hands folded in my lap. It's not just about the money. It never is, she said. You were made into the foundation. Now they're mad you're stepping out from under them. I told her everything. The spreadsheet, the party, the envelope, the trust account, the will, the missing inheritance. Elise's charm. Rowan's entitlement. My parents' silence. Alma didn't blink. She just nodded, asked clarifying questions, took notes in neat columns. When I told her about the house, about the promise made in the garden, and the truth I'd uncovered, she leaned back and tapped her pen lightly against the desk. You want to protect them, but also protect yourself, she said. That's doable. But it's going to require structure. Boundaries, paper, not feelings, I almost laughed. I have a lot of paper. Good, she said. Then let's make it mean something. I left her office with a folder tucked under my arm and the beginnings of a plan. Not revenge, not restitution, just something firmer than hope, something legal, something binding. The house may not have been mine in name, but I was done letting it become a monument to everyone else's mistakes. If I couldn't inherit what I was promised, then I'd build something they couldn't take. The first thing Alma said after I'd laid everything out, every spreadsheet, every scanned withdrawal, every unpaid debt cloaked as family loyalty, wasn't legalese. It was a sentence delivered without blinking, without theatrics. This isn't just toxic Julia, it's financial abuse. She didn't say it for effect. She said it like it was fact, like she'd said it before in different offices to different women holding their own folders full of invisible labor and invisible ledgers. You've been subsidizing a system that gaslights you in return, she added, adjusting her glasses and flipping to the last page of a statement. They've taught you to feel guilty for setting boundaries because those boundaries threaten their access. I sat in the same chair I had last week, but it felt different this time. Like the ground had shifted under my feet and finally stilled in a place that made sense. I don't want to punish them, I said. I just don't want to be used anymore. Alma nodded. Then we create structure. You don't need confrontation, you need architecture. It was her word choice, deliberate and perhaps even strategic. My father had always respected structure. He dismissed feelings as messy but paperwork terms. Contracts. Those were sacred. We worked out the plan over the course of 2 meetings. Alma had a whiteboard and a way of distilling pain into bullet points without minimizing it. This is about protecting what's left of your peace, she said at one point. Not about repairing what was never built on solid ground. The first part of the strategy was simple. In theory complex, in execution, I would purchase the family home at its current appraised value not from my parents directly, but through a private real estate trust set up in my name with clear stipulations and third-party oversight. This way, the house wouldn't be lost to another refinance scheme or impulsive loan against equity. It would be shielded from both emotional pressure and financial chaos. The second part involved a residency clause. My parents, Robert and Marla, would retain full rights to live in the home for as long as they wished rent-free, but they would not own it. They could not lease it, borrow against it, or transfer rights to anyone, not even Elise or Rowan. The clause would trigger an automatic legal freeze if any unauthorized financial activity occurred. Alma called it a living boundary. It sounded clinical. That helped. The third part was personal but essential. No more informal favors. Any financial assistance moving forward, medical housing emergency, would go through a separate fund managed independently with documentation. No calls from Mom asking me to float Elise a little something. No texts from Rowan with just until Friday in the subject line. It was either formalized or non-existent. At one point, I hesitated. This makes me look cold. Alma looked up from her notes. You're not cutting them off. You're drawing a line they can't erase. That's not cold. That's clear. I let the silence stretch, unsure of what to say. The word cutting lingered in my head. It didn't feel like what I was doing. Cutting sounded violent. This felt surgical, like removing a cyst that had been growing for years under the surface, benign in name only. We can call the trust the Marlin Fund, Alma offered. Keep it neutral. She smiled faintly. Or go bolder. The Vexler line, if you want to send a message. I laughed once, just a puff of air, but it surprised me. Call it whatever keeps them from turning it into a group text topic. Alma drafted the paperwork that afternoon. She worked fast, efficient like someone who'd seen too many women wait too long to protect themselves. You know, she said, sliding the first draft across the desk, a lot of people think boundaries are walls. But they're doors too, just with locks and keys. You get to choose who comes in. I thought about that later as I walked back to my car, passing a couple arguing softly outside a sandwich shop, their tones low and resigned. I thought about it as I passed the park Elise and I used to play in back when we were just sisters, not cautionary tales for each other's children. The next morning, I wired the first payment into the holding account. Not because I was ready to forgive, and not because they'd earned it. I did it because I wanted the house safe from their carelessness. I protected the way I'd never been. By the end of the week, the trust was active. The documents were signed, a letter was drafted and sealed. One I would deliver myself. It outlined everything the ownership changed, the conditions, the protections. No emotion, no blame, just structure. I didn't know how they'd react. I didn't care. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to preserve their comfort. I was preserving my clarity, and this time the line wouldn't move. It was almost dusk when I heard the knock. Not a polite, neighborly tap, but a sharp, impatient rhythm, the kind Elise used when we were kids and she wanted in on my side of the room. I didn't answer right away. I waited a moment, mug in hand, staring through the peephole until I saw the familiar silhouette blazer over a yoga set hair, twisted into a loose bun, eyes rimmed with mascara she hadn't reapplied in hours. She looked tired but defiant. Elise never came to talk. She came to persuade, or to cry. This time I wasn't sure which it would be. I opened the door halfway. She stepped in without waiting. Same as always, like my space had never belonged to me. I'm not staying long, she said, standing in the middle of the living room like she didn't know where to sit. I can't believe you'd actually go through with it. With what I asked, though, I already knew. The house she snapped, the trust, the clause about Mom and Dad not being able to transfer anything. Do you realize what you're doing? Yes, I said. I'm protecting the only asset left from being drained to death. Her lips parted like I'd slapped her. You're tearing the family apart. I set my mug down on the side table. No, Elise. I'm exposing the fact that it was never whole. She flinched. Just a flicker. Then the mask hardened. You think this is some noble stand, don't you? That locking down a house makes you some kind of savior? No, I said. But I do think someone had to stop pretending that this house was anything more than a bank you kept returning to with new lies and new keys. Her voice dropped. You think I wanted this? I stayed quiet. She folded her arms, gaze narrowing. Kyle needed capital. We couldn't get approved for a business loan, so yes, we used the deed, just as collateral. It was supposed to be short-term, a bridge. And the bridge collapsed, I said flatly. Her shoulders sank. You think I don't know that? No, I said. I think you do. I just think you hoped no one would look under the water. Silence settled. Elise took a slow breath and sat on the edge of my couch like it stung her to touch it. When Dad found out, he didn't yell. He just said, "We'll figure it out." You weren't even mentioned. Of course not, I said. Because I was only supposed to show up once everything fell apart. I didn't mean for this to affect everyone. It already did, I said. You just didn't have to feel it. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. She stared down at her hands. Her wedding ring was gone. I hadn't noticed until now. Kyle left, she said after a moment, packed a suitcase and said he couldn't keep being blamed for everything. I had told him he wasn't being blamed. He said, That was the problem. No one was being blamed. I didn't reply. There was nothing to say that didn't sound like a verdict. So she said, voice thin now, "You really think this fixes it? Owning the house? It's not about ownership," I said. "It's about control. About stopping the bleeding before there's nothing left but apology and paperwork." Her chin trembled. "You're not saving the house for us." I nodded. "No, I'm saving it from you," that was the truth. Brutal, maybe, but necessary. The house had been weaponized for too long, held over my head, borrowed against without a second thought, used as currency and family loyalty I never quite qualified for. Now it was a wall align in legal ink, something they couldn't rewrite in the heat of an argument or the haze of guilt. Elise stood slowly. She looked smaller than she had when she arrived, like someone deflating in real time. "You used to be kind, Julia." "No," I said, holding her gaze. "I used to be quiet." She didn't argue, she didn't cry, she just nodded once, walked to the door, and let herself out without another word. And for the first time, I didn't follow her, I didn't explain, I didn't second guess. I closed the door, turned the lock, and stood in the silence I had chosen for myself. Not the silence I used to be sentenced to. Mine. Finally. He called just after 7. Not a text, not an email. A full, unscheduled voice call, something Rowan rarely did unless he needed something signed or wired. I almost didn't pick up, but I was already holding the phone when it lit up, and part of me wanted to know what angle he'd come at this time. I answered with a simple, "Julia." He didn't waste time. "You're making Dad sick over this." His voice was tight, sharp around the edges like he'd rehearsed it. "He's not sleeping. Mom says he's barely eating. You couldn't have just talked to us first." I leaned back in my chair, eyes on the ceiling. "Talk to you? Like when you took out equity for a vineyard and didn't tell anyone until it collapsed. Or when Elise used the deed as loan collateral for a man who ghosted her 2 weeks ago. That's different," he snapped. "It always is." There was a pause. I could hear him pacing. Probably outside, probably still in one of those overpriced bomber jackets he wore like they made him important. "You've always thought you were better than us," he said. "Like, you're the only one who's ever sacrificed anything for this family." I didn't answer that. I didn't have to. He kept going. "Dad built that house with his bare hands." "No, I cut in. A contractor built that house. Dad supervised one Saturday and took all the credit. Let's not revise history just because it's convenient now." "Jesus, Julia." Rowan muttered. "Do you even care how this is going to look? You're locking down the family home with legal clauses like some hostile takeover. You didn't even give us a chance." I stood up, slowly walked to the bookshelf in my office, and pulled out an old external hard drive. I'd kept it mostly for archiving contracts, backup files, the kind of stuff you never need until you desperately do. I scrolled through the folders until I found an old voicemail I'd saved without knowing why. I tapped the speakerphone button. "You want to know why I didn't give you a chance? Because you don't trust anyone." "No," I said. "Because I heard this." I played the message. The audio quality wasn't great, but the voice was unmistakably Dad's, low and gruff with the slight rasp that came from years of cigars and judgment. "She's not going to let this go," he said. There was a pause, a sigh, then the part I remembered word for word. "Rowan's a mess, but he's my son. Julia, she's not even part of this legacy." The recording ended. Silence on the line. I let it hang. "Where the hell did you get that?" he asked. Finally voice quieter. He left it for me. By mistake, I think. Didn't realize he hadn't hung up before talking to one of his buddies after I turned down the company consulting role. You know, the one that came with no salary and all the PR cleanup, more silence. Rowan. I said softer now, not out of kindness, but exhaustion. You were always the heir. I was the contingency, the backup, the one expected to fund the mess and smile politely while being left off the brochure. "You think this is easy for me?" he said. A little shaky now. "You think it's easy living in his shadow and still not being enough?" I almost laughed. "Rowan, you were enough the moment you were born a son." That landed hard. I could feel it through the static. I continued, gentler but firm. "I'm not doing this to spite you. I'm doing this because I refuse to keep pretending that I was ever part of the system he claimed he built for all of us. I'm protecting myself for once." He exhaled. So that's it. You've chosen your side. No, I said. I've chosen to stop standing in the middle while you all push from both ends. He didn't respond. Not right away. Then finally, he's still our dad. I know. And we're still your family. I know that too. Another pause. You're not going to undo it. No, I said. And I suggest you don't try. He hung up without saying goodbye. I stared at the phone a moment longer, then set it down gently beside the file marked Vexler Trust. Final. I didn't cry, I didn't even feel relief, just a dull, familiar ache in the place where loyalty used to live. Rowan had called to bluff, to rattle the doors and see if I'd unlatch one out of guilt or habit. But this time, they were locked, and I had the only key. The folder was heavier than it looked. A slim stack of final documents, each one bearing a different weight title: transfer trust certification, residency clause, enforcement terms. Alma had gone over every page with her signature red pen, double-checked every clause twice. No room for ambiguity, she said, as she slid the packet across her desk that morning. No room for second chances wrapped in guilt. I waited until I got home to send the email. I drafted it twice, deleted the first version. Too clinical. The second read like an apology. The third stayed. Short, clear, just a subject line and 3 attachments. Subject control. Accountability. Body documents enclosed. Signing is set for Thursday through p.m. Julia. No explanations. No warm greetings. No open-ended questions. They replied. An hour later. Well, Marla did. We'll be there. Nothing else. Not even her usual exclamation point. On Thursday, I arrived at Alma's office 10 minutes early. The meeting room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and copy paper. A glass pitcher of water sat in the center of the conference table, flanked by a tray of unused legal pads and a silent clock that ticked just loud enough to mark the weight of every second passing. At exactly 3 o'clock, they walked in together. Robert Vexler looked smaller than I remembered. Not in body, he still had the bulk of a man who spent most of his life filling space, but in energy. His eyes, once sharp with calculation, now looked dulled by something slower. Not confusion. Weariness, maybe. Resignation. Marla followed closely behind, holding a small leather purse, with both hands like it might keep her grounded. She wore a soft pink cardigan, the same one I'd seen her in at 3 different birthdays, 2 Mother's Days, and the Thanksgiving where Elise's dog knocked over the cranberry sauce and she cried for 20 minutes. Alma stood as they entered, offered them each a polite handshake. Robert, Marla, thank you for coming. No one smiled. We took our seats. Alma opened the meeting without flourish, walking through each document with quiet precision. This transaction is structured as a private trust acquisition, she began. The terms grant full property title to the Vexler Legacy Trust, of which Julia is sole trustee. Robert didn't look at me, not once. Marla sat stiffly, nodding too much, her eyes darting between each page like she was searching for an escape clause that didn't exist. Alma continued steady as ever. Your right to reside in the home is preserved indefinitely provided the terms of the agreement are met, namely that no secondary loans or financial instruments are taken against the property, and no transfer of occupancy is made to third parties. That part caught Robert's attention. His jaw flexed, but he said nothing. Marla finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, barely audible over the shuffle of papers. I didn't know it had come to this. I turned to her, then slowly. It came to this a long time ago. We're just signing the paperwork now. She blinked, then looked down. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, twisting her wedding ring, then letting it go. When Alma slid the pen toward them, Robert signed without hesitation. No questions, no snide remarks, no grandstand speech about betrayal or disrespect. Just his name in clean slanted handwriting. Marla hesitated longer. Her hand trembled slightly as she brought the pen down. When she finished, she looked at me, not accusing, not apologizing. Just tired. You've really done your homework, she whispered. I lived it, I said. I just finally stopped erasing it. Alma gathered the papers quickly, efficient as ever, sliding them into a binder and nodding once. That completes the transfer. You'll receive digital copies within the hour. The trust is now fully executed and enforceable. Robert stood first. We'll let ourselves out. Marla followed slower. At the door, she turned briefly. Her eyes met mine, and for half a second I thought she might say something. But she just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and left. The door clicked shut behind them. Alma let out a quiet breath and turned to me. You okay? I nodded. I'm not sure what I expected, but I'm glad it's done. She smiled gently. Done doesn't mean resolved. It just means protected. I gathered my things without rushing. I didn't feel victorious or vindicated, but I felt grounded. Like the floor was no longer shifting beneath me. I walked out into the gray afternoon with the signed trust tucked under my arm, not as a trophy, but as proof that I had drawn a line, that it held, that I didn't need their permission to build something that would finally last. It was almost midnight when the knock came. Not aggressive, not timid 3 quick raps just enough to freeze the air in the room. I was in the kitchen barefoot rinsing a mug I hadn't used. I paused listening. 3 more. I turned off the faucet and walked to the door, slowly, deliberately. There was only one person in the family who knocked like that. Everyone else either barged in or called first. Elise. I opened the door, but not all the way. She stood there in a hooded jacket hair in a loose knot, dark circles under her eyes. She looked less like herself and more like the ghost of someone trying to resemble her. No makeup, no polished veneer, just Elise stripped down and raw. Can I come in? She asked, her voice low. I held the door for a beat longer than I needed to, then stepped aside. She walked in like she had before, but slower now, more tentative. She didn't sit, just hovered near the edge of the coffee table, arms folded across her chest like she was bracing for something. I won't stay long, she said, not meeting my eyes. I needed to ask. Why didn't you tell us how much you were carrying? The question hung in the air like dust in lamplight. Not hostile, just tired, just late. I leaned against the back of the armchair and looked at her for a long second. Because you wouldn't have heard it unless I screamed. She swallowed, eyes flickering to the window, then back to me. Maybe I would have. No, I said gently. You would have said I was overreacting, or too focused on money, or making things transactional again. She closed her eyes for a beat as if that sentence had weight. You're right, she said. I probably would have said all those things. I didn't say anything. There was no point in punctuating a confession that spoke for itself. I keep going over it. She continued pacing now, one hand brushing her elbow. All the times you showed up, and I thought you just wanted to. That it was easy for you, like maybe giving was your love language or whatever. It wasn't, I said. It was the only language you understood. That landed. Her shoulders folded inward slightly, like her spine didn't quite want to hold the truth. I guess I thought, you had so much. She looked around the room at my furniture, my framed prints, the neatness of it all. It never occurred to me that you were holding everything together while we acted like it was all just working itself out. It didn't occur to you because you didn't have to think about it, I said. That was the design. You got to live in the part of the house that didn't creak. I was underneath it with a wrench. She nodded slowly. Her fingers traced the edge of the coffee table. So, what now? I stood up straighter, not unkindly. Now you live inside your means, like I always had to. Her face twisted just slightly, not in anger, in realization. It's hard, I know I said. That's the point. Silence again. Not a cruel one, just honest. The kind that comes after an earthquake when people start inspecting what's still standing. I didn't come here to ask for anything, she said after a moment. I know better now. Good, I said, not smiling. Because I'm not offering. She finally sat down on the edge of the couch, legs tucked under her. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I lost more than money this year. I stayed where I was. So did I. I think we all pretended you were made of something stronger. No, I said. You all pretended I didn't break because you never stuck around to watch me do it. She didn't deny it, just nodded, quiet, small. The way you do when you're trying not to collapse in front of someone who stopped catching you years ago. She stood again softly, as if waking from something. I should go. I walked her to the door, hand on the knob. She turned back before stepping out. If I try to do better, would that matter? I met her eyes. To me? Maybe. To you, it has to. She nodded, then left without another word. No dramatic exit. No tears. I locked the door behind her and stood there for a long moment, forehead resting against the wood. That knock had come late, but not too late. And for the first time in our lives, she hadn't asked me to open the door for her. She'd asked to be let in. And that, at least, was something. The first snow came early that December. It dusted the tops of the hedges outside my window like powdered sugar and made the whole street seem quieter, like even the air had agreed to keep its voice down. I stood in the kitchen with a chipped ceramic mug of peppermint tea, watching the sky turn that pale winter blue that only shows up in the morning, soft and disinterested. For the first time in a decade, I hadn't bought a single Christmas gift. No frantic last-minute orders. No bank transfers labeled just in case. No envelope tucked inside a card with the exact amount to cover Rowan's heating bill or Elise's daughter's ballet recital. There was nothing this year, and that, strangely, was everything. I didn't decorate. I didn't need to. The silence was its own garland. The peace was its own string of lights. 3 days before Christmas, a single envelope arrived. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. Marla's was always perfectly round, almost childlike, like she'd taken penmanship classes that never quite left her. I waited until evening to open it after I'd lit the fireplace and turned on one lamp in the corner, just enough light to read, but not enough to invite company. The card inside was simple, an off-white linen stock with a painted pine tree. Inside, just one sentence written in that careful looped script. "We didn't deserve your grace, but thank you anyway." There was no signature, no mention of Robert, no plea. Just that one clean sentence tucked into a plain envelope like it was afraid to take up too much space. I didn't cry, I didn't call, I didn't reread it more than once. Instead, I walked over to the drawer where I'd filed the final trust document, the one with all the signatures, the notarized stamp, the paper trail of every decision that had led me here. I slid the card in behind it like it belonged in the same story. Not because it made anything okay, not because it changed what had happened, but because it was true. And true things, I've learned, deserve a place even if they arrive late. That night, I sat by the fire with no noise but the crackle of wood and the wind tapping softly against the window pane. No blinking lights, no Bing Crosby crooning from some half-hearted speaker. Just the stillness that came when the debts were paid and no new ones would be taken on. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't waiting to be acknowledged or folded back in. I didn't want to be celebrated. I didn't need my name on a stocking or thank you wrapped in silver ribbon. I had quiet. I had boundaries. And for the first Christmas in 10 years, I had nothing to return. The podium wasn't grand, just a modest wooden lectern in a sunlit room at the downtown Civic Center, surrounded by folding chairs, tall coffee urns, and a lineup of women in blazers and sensible heels. The event was called Legacy in Numbers, a local women's finance summit sponsored by a nonprofit I'd quietly donated to for years. When they first asked me to speak, I nearly said no. Public vulnerability never came easy, but something about the timing felt earned. As I stepped onto the low riser and adjusted the mic, I scanned the room. It was a sea of faces that reminded me of myself 10 years ago. Women who had worked twice as hard stayed 3 times as quiet, and still apologized when their voices trembled. I began, simply. They told me legacy was earned through loyalty. I said letting the words hang, but I learned it's protected by boundaries. There were a few soft nods. One woman tilted her head slightly like she'd just realized something that had never quite clicked before. I spoke for 20 minutes. Not about numbers or market trends, though I knew both by heart. I talked about the math that didn't show up on spreadsheets, the years I covered someone else's debt, the mental interest I paid every time I swallowed my pride to preserve a holiday dinner, the sunk cost of silence. I told them about the night I stopped giving out of obligation and started drawing lines out of self-respect. I didn't use my family's names. I didn't have to. When I finished, the applause was warm, not thunderous, but real. During the Q&A, hands shot up quickly. A few questions were about budgeting tools, investment apps, retirement accounts. But one came from a girl near the back, maybe 22, maybe younger. She had thick glasses, nervous fingers, and the kind of voice that cracked when the truth was still new in your mouth. "But do you still love them?" she asked. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't even curious. It was scared, like she was trying to figure out how much love she was allowed to hold if it didn't look like sacrifice. I took a moment. Then I said, "I love them enough to stop letting them break me." The room fell still. I didn't elaborate. I didn't soften the edge. Because sometimes the bravest thing isn't leaving. It's choosing to stay on your side of the fence and still love what's on the other side from a distance. Quietly. Without handing over your tools every time they want to tear it down again. After the session, a few women lingered to thank me. One handed me a folded note. Another just squeezed my arm and said I needed that. Backstage, I placed the note in my bag and looked around one last time. No banner bore my name, no framed photo of me hung on the wall. But I didn't need those symbols anymore. I had built my own table, and this time I chose who got a seat. The table was smaller now, 4 seats, not 12. Maple, not mahogany. No chandelier above it. Just a woven pendant light that cast soft gold across the dishes I'd thrifted over the summer. I'd cooked everything myself, though no one expected that. Lemon roasted chicken cracked pepper biscuits, a small pear tart with cinnamon crust. Nothing extravagant, but it was warm, intentional, mine. 3 of the chairs were filled. Tanya, my neighbor, who had helped me carry in a Craigslist sofa when I moved. Mel, the retired teacher from 2 floors up who liked to swap soup recipes. And Harper, a former intern from the foundation now in her first job, glowing with nervous energy and too many opinions about Roth IRAs. The laughter at the table was light, not forced. They passed bowls, refilled glasses, and lingered after bites, not because of tradition, but because it felt good to stay. One chair remained empty. It wasn't a mistake. I'd placed it intentionally across from me. Not to make a statement, not even to invite speculation, but to remind myself just because something used to be full doesn't mean I have to refill it. After dinner, while the others helped clear dishes and I tucked away leftovers, Harper lingered by the window wine glass in hand. "You know," she said, "your place has that feeling. Like, you don't need anything from anyone." I smiled faintly, drying a plate. "That's the idea." She looked toward the table where the one empty chair still sat. "Do people ask about why there's not more?" "All the time," I said. "People ask why I don't invite them back in, why I don't reach out, why I didn't try harder to fix things, and what do you say she asked?" I folded the towel slowly. "I say I left the door unlocked, but I also kept the chair empty because I no longer fill what they abandon." She didn't respond right away, just nodded as if something settled inside her, as if maybe one day she'd do the same. When everyone left, the apartment quieted again. I poured a final cup of tea, turned off the music, and looked back at the table. It was funny how peace used to feel like absence. How, for years, I mistook being needed for being loved. How I built whole rooms around people who never noticed the foundation. But now, I understood something different. That leaving space isn't the same as leaving hope. That boundaries don't end stories, they shape them. I didn't need reconciliation to write my ending. I didn't need permission to stop bleeding just because they called it family. I walked over to the chair, ran a hand along the back of it, then turned off the light. There would always be a place for those who came in truth, but I'd never again pour myself into what refused to hold me. And that, at last, was enough.